What they do is capture the name of the broker. And not, as opposed to Rabbi Barris, here he is. Oh, might as well get the stuff. I don't know how I scooped yours, but I just.
Test 1, 2.
New slacks.
Nice to see you in living color.
Hey, you're welcome home.
Home for now weeks. Great.
What? Not very nice.
I'm set for a volunteer program in Israel mid-March.
Oh, you are?
A week, yeah. I'm only going to do a week because
I'll be there for 4 days.
And I'll go before and stay after Purim weekend. I timed it that way, so I'll go to my
Okay.
family for Purim.
Nice, nice. Oh, thank you.
The room is filling up.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Here we go. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. Amen. L'chaim. Okay, and blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, Torah portion is called B'Shalach. It's the Torah portion of the splitting of the Red Sea and the Song of the Sea. It's Shabbat Shirah, which means the Song of the Sea, or the Sabbath of the Sea. I want to... What? Yeah, whatever. However you want to do it. Shabbat Shirah. Sabbath of Song. Okay. It's easier in Hebrew. We want to look at what happened today when the Jews left Egypt and try to figure out the order of how it happened. So as the Torah portion begins, so last week we had Parshat Bo, and it ended with the plagues, the end of the plagues. And the Jews are going to now leave. As they leave, it's not so simple. There are different things that happen, and how they happen in the verses goes very quickly. And if you don't look at it closely, you could miss some of the very important nuance of what happens when they leave. Now, it seems pretty orderly. It seems pretty orderly, which means to say that there's the 10th plague, there's the outcry. The Jews didn't suffer the 10th plague because they put blood on their doorposts. And so in the places where they lived, people didn't die. Now, one of the things you think of with the death of the firstborn is that in each home one person died. But the truth is that the Egyptians had more than one wife. So there could have been many firstborn in each house. And there are also plenty of illegitimate children. You don't know who the mother is or whatever, or maybe the mother wasn't around anymore. And so people were dying, and it wasn't exactly clear what the rhyme or reason was as to who was dying. And so at first, when you wake up and all these people are dead, and you're probably not that surprised, because you just experienced 9 other plagues that were a little weird. By the time you've had the blood and the frogs and the lice and the hail and all the other things that ruined your life, So something else happens, you say, okay, this is how it goes here. This is not such a great period for us. But now, all that you wake up and all these people are dead, you don't know, as an Egyptian, that you're not next to die. You don't exactly necessarily put two, this is all the firstborn. You wake up, you see someone's dead. So how long did it take before everyone put two and two together? Who died in this house? Who died? It's all the firstborn. It might have been a while. But the immediate reaction is he had the blood, he had the frogs, he had all this stuff. Now their God is coming to kill us. And how do I know that tonight when I go to sleep, I'm not waking up? Maybe tomorrow night is the secondborn. Maybe tomorrow night is the women. You don't know. But it's not something you want to mess with. So if you're an Egyptian, what do? You say to the Jews,
Go.
right,
Gonna
right. Now, the Jews then go, and the first thing that we see in this week's Torah portion is that they don't go towards the Plishtim. Now, Plishtim means Philistines. Philistines lived on the border between Israel and Egypt. Not the Gaza Strip, but pretty close. So there's this other nation, the Philistines, which are a smaller nation compared to Egypt. But if you're a smaller nation living in the shadow of a bigger nation, back then, you're generally a vassal state, and you pay taxes. Because if you don't, then you don't remain that state, you get taken over. So the Jews are leaving and they go towards the Philistines. But have you ever asked the question, what's the relationship between Egypt and the Philistines? So if the Jews are running away from Egypt, and the Egyptians come and chase them, and they're stuck in between the Egyptians and the Philistines aren't going to help the Jews. It's one of the things when the, yes?
Microphone is speaking.
Back in those times, firstborn, you would assume firstborn male. But I think it's interesting to note that it wasn't, according to at least the English, it wasn't firstborn male. Did the rabbis say anything about it's just firstborn, including the little girls?
Which verse are you looking at? Let's take a look. Let's take a look.
4 and
Chapter
5.
13. Chapter 13?
10.
Chapter 10? No.
Right.
So
Oh, chapter 11, I think.
in chapter 13, it's male, but
Oh, it says male?
yeah.
No, but here, in this book, it's page 451. They're at the end.
But what's the verse number? Because I have a
4.
different book.
4 and 5 at the bottom there.
Yeah, it's male. In Hebrew, every word is male or female, and the only word there is bechor, which refers to the male.
So it's lost in translation. So
Yeah.
I get it. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Okay.
Pharaoh was not a firstborn. His sister was obviously older, so he didn't count as a firstborn.
I guess he didn't die.
He didn't die.
I
so-
don't know. We don't know exactly who the Pharaoh was, so it's hard to say. Okay. What? It's okay. Just trying to remember what I was talking about. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. Look, when you get to my age, it's tough. Okay. So if you're the Jews and you go in between the Egypt and the Philistines, and the Philistines are friends with the Egyptians, that's worse than getting in between Egypt and the water. Because the Philistines aren't going to help you. And it reminds you, by the way, if you escaped from a ghetto or a concentration camp during the Holocaust, and you ran to the civilians, the non-Jewish civilians, that's no help, because they'll turn you in. By the way, I don't know if any of you read the book, The Escape Artist. I read this year, about the two people who actually escaped from Auschwitz. It's a true story. The guy was actually here as part of the author was here as, not the person who escaped, but the man who wrote the book about it was here as part of the Barron Book Festival. But it's an incredible book. You read about how two Jews escaped from Auschwitz. I think there were 4 total who escaped, but it's incredible. But just because you escaped, you can't, we're free. No, everyone else hates you too. Well, so now you escape from Egypt, and they're the Philistines. They're not your friends. All right. Okay. So if you look now, we're gonna start chapter. The Torah portion of Beshalach starts with chapter 13, verse 17. That's not a random verse that I'm picking. That's just where the Torah portion starts. Okay. So everyone have the beginning of Beshalach. Okay. Okay, Norman, would you into the mic?
Now when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt.
Right, so the Torah portion tells us you'll go to the Philistines, and the Philistines are not your friends. They're going to... they may want to fight with you too, and then you will have an option. The option is to go back to Egypt, which is the wrong direction of where I need you to go, so we're not going to go that way. So, let's see how you do with swimming instead.
It says, I'm sure everybody can see it, that it's generally believed to be an anachronism, that the Philistines didn't arrive for at least 150 years later.
Who's that? Plout?
Well, Plout said about the anachronism. I'm saying about they didn't arrive for about 150 years later.
Who,
That's
the
a Hoffman.
Philistines?
Yeah.
I mean,
Never mind.
How you could know within 150 years that far back is pretty tricky. It's pretty tricky. So, I mean, I guess it's possible, but it'd just be a weird thing to write in the Torah. Maybe there was someone else there. I don't know, but it's kind of a weird thing to write. However, I would say this. It doesn't really matter. Here's why. I was going to point this out later, but it doesn't really matter. When we're going to see where they go. The Torah gives us place names of where they go. Places like Ramses, they travel from Ramses to Etam and to Sukkot. those are cities that are in Egypt. So once they leave and they go towards the Philistines, they're still in Egyptian territory. So whether it was the Philistines or not, they're people who are on the not their side, but are on the Egyptian side, which is really interesting. Now, I mean, I don't know how he could have stratified it to the point where you know exactly who they are, whether they're Philistines or not. Maybe there's some, epigraphic evidence that was uncovered that I'm not aware of. I'd be interested to see the source of that. But either way, it's still interesting that the people that they're around are maybe not unpleasant to them, but they might be. And that's what the Torah says. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 18.
So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt, and Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had exacted an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will be sure to take notice of you. Then you shall carry up my bones from here with you. They set out from Sukkot and encamped at Etam, at the edge of the wilderness. The Eternal went before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they may travel day and night.
Okay. Without looking back at those verses that we just read, as the Jews leave Egypt, who's leading the people? Who's not leading Egypt? Who's not leading the Jews? How did you all know that? You're supposed to have missed that. You all caught. That was amazing. Moses is not leading the Jews when they leave Egypt. Did you see that? Well, you did. You just told me. But that's incredible. The Jews leave Egypt, and Moses has been doing all the things with the frogs. And who's the leader? And now they leave. And God's leading them out. And a good question would be, well, what's Moses doing and why isn't he leading the people? But it's very subtle. How do we know this? Only from 2 verses. So look at verse 17. It happened when Pharaoh sent the people that God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, because it was near, for God said, perhaps the people will reconsider when they see war. And 18, and God took the people around towards Yam Suf, towards the Red Sea. And the children of Israel were armed. Moses is doing something else. He's concerned with something else besides leading the Jewish people. Okay, now, at what point does Moses go back for Joseph? So the answer comes from the Talmud. So if you look on the sheet, the first source is Bavli Sota, the Babylonian Talmud, the Tractate of Sota, page 13a. Judy, do you have a mic?
Yeah.
Would you mind reading? So, by the way, the amplification of the story of Exodus primarily comes from this Tractate of Talmud. Sota, you know what a sota is? Sota is a suspected adulteress. Sota is the name of the drink that they made her and her stomach exploded. We'll get there in a few months. But it also just happens to be, because the sota happened when they were in the wilderness, that story, you get a lot of the interesting holes of the stories from the Exodus in this Tractate of Talmud. So that's why we're here. It's not just about soft drinks. Sota, it's all. So, because it's a drink. Now, I mean, it's one of the great ironies in human history, in linguistic history, that sota, which is the Torah word for a drink that's really, in essence, not good for you, sounds like soda. I mean, it's one of the great ironies in linguistic history. They're not connected at all, but it happened. Just one of those things. And that's the kind of information you're only going to get in this class. Yes?
Very quick question. How did the Jews get armed? It doesn't matter how loud.
Well, so they took it during the 9th plague. They fleeced Egypt and took everything. So that's where they got it.
But the Egyptians let them be armed?
Yeah, not only that, they encouraged it. They encouraged it. Yeah, they actually encouraged it. So we did discuss that last week, but that's where it goes. Yes.
Yeah, I have written down, I'm sorry, but I have written down that armed is not a direct translation. You don't know what the exact Hebrew word means.
I'm very concerned with what the stuff you're reading.
That is not in Plout. I won't say where that's from.
I mean, the word is chamushim. The word is chamushim. Anyone who knows modern Hebrew knows, like a chamush in modern Hebrew is someone with a gun. I mean, it means, I mean, the word does mean armed. I don't know, does anyone here speak modern Hebrew? Do you know this word? Chamush? I mean, you see it a lot in the news these days. Terrorists are often called chamushim or mechablim, but sometimes chamushim. So, yeah, I don't know. It really does mean that, as far as I know. Yeah, I mean, the Hebrew. So Rashi says, the word chamushim in this context can only mean armed. That's Rashi. I mean, you can take it or leave it, but that's what he says. I don't have any other comment on that. But let's take a look at the Talmud. The Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, and from where did Moses, our teacher, know where Joseph was buried? The sages said, Sarah, the daughter of Asher, remained from that generation that initially descended to Egypt with Jacob.
Wait, who's Asher? One of the tribes, one of the
Right.
12 sons of Jacob. His daughter's still alive. But honestly, for her age, she was still pretty fit. She was still, for her age, for 350. People used to tell you don't look a day over 300. I mean, she was still pretty fit. Okay.
Moses went to her and said to her, do you know anything about where Joseph is buried? She said to him, the Egyptians fashioned a metal casket for him and set it in the Nile River as an augury so that its water would be blessed. Moses went and stood by the bank of the Nile. He said to Joseph, 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 the time has arrived about which the Holy One, blessed be he, took an oath saying that I, God, will redeem you. And the time for fulfillment of the oath that you administered to the Jewish people, that they will bury you in the Eretz Israel, has arrived. If you show yourself, it is good. But if not, we are clear from your oath immediately. The casket of Joseph floated to the top of the water.
Okay, now, I have to admit, there are a variety of different explanations among the rabbis as to how they found Joseph's grave, Joseph's coffin. And, the generally accepted thing is when Jacob gives blessings to all of the tribes at the end of the book of Genesis, and he refers to Joseph, he refers to him as an ox. And so when Moses comes to the water, he says some sort of magical spell invoking the word ox, and the coffin came up from the water. So why did the Egyptians bury Joseph in a lead casket and sink him to the bottom of the Nile? Because they felt that he was a blessing and that sustenance, he was the key to their sustenance. And if they didn't have the blessing of him in the water, then they wouldn't continue to have water and food and everything and so forth. So they said, let's put him in the water. Now, there's a problem with this. The problem is when Jacob dies, they go back to Israel and they bury him. And Joseph goes too. And all the brothers go. But then all the brothers are back in Israel. Why don't they just stay there? Why do they come back to Egypt? Now we know that many Egyptians went with them. and that there were tons of guards and important Egyptians who went with them to bury Jacob for a variety of reasons, one of which was to honor Jacob. But also, there was another reason they were there. Very good. How do you guys know?
Repeat it, what she said.
Make sure that Joseph came back. Joseph was not allowed to stay in Israel. Pharaoh sent his guards to make sure that Joseph came back because they needed Joseph for their blessing of the food and everything. At least that's what they thought. Which means that Joseph was not free to leave Egypt, which means that in essence, Joseph was the first slave. He was not free to go. I mean, he was like, it was kind of how the king of Saudi Arabia imprisons his slaves at the Four Seasons. You know, you will be confined to your suite at the Four Seasons, and, right, like in Coming to America. You remember Simi? He's living in this dump, and the king comes and he said, you will be confined to your suite at the Waldorf Astoria. And he's like, all right. It's Arsenio Hall in the good day. But, so, you know, Joseph wasn't out there picking fruits and vegetables, but he couldn't leave. I mean, he could leave for the funeral, but he had to come back. Yeah. Can you pass the mic back?
I see a parallel between the basket and the casket because Moses
rhyme.
saved Joseph from the Nile, saved being to bring him back to
Very
Israel, and Moses was saved from the Nile in order to save the Jewish people from
Very
Israel.
nice. Very nice. So the Nile is a big factor here. Yeah. If you look at verse 19, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he made the children of Israel swear, God will surely remember you, and you shall bring my bones up from here for you. Rashi there says, Ken, would you mind reading that Rashi, the second source on the page?
He had straitly adjured. He had made them swear that they would make their children swear. But why did he not make his sons swear that they would take him to the land of Canaan immediately upon his death, as Jacob had made his sons swear?
Right. In other words, Jacob says to his sons, as soon as I die, take me back to Israel. Joseph doesn't say that to his sons. Joseph doesn't get his sons together and say, listen, when I die, take me back. He says to the Jews, when you leave and you're never coming back, then take me with you. Okay, so do you see the difference in the question? Or in the request? Okay, so here's the answer. Joseph said,
I was a ruler in Egypt, and I had sufficient power to do what my father desired, but my sons, the Egyptians will not permit them to do this. Consequently, he made them swear that when they would be delivered and would go forth from there, that they would take him up with them.
right, the Egyptians wouldn't let it happen. When I die, Joseph's giving prophecy here. He's saying, when I die, there's going to be a Pharaoh who won't remember me. And they won't let you take me out because they need me. These idiots think that I'm, but so they're not going to let me leave. So you're not going to be allowed to take me. And hundreds of years are going to pass, and the Jews will not have been allowed to take me out. But eventually you're going to leave. And when that happens way down the road, please don't forget me.
By the way, one of the not very well known parts of Bavli Sota about the blessings from the casket of Joseph was that Ein Sof Besuf, but not many people know that.
Right.
There's no death in the Sea of Reeds.
Right.
There's no end.
Sof means end or death, and Suf means reeds. The Red Sea is called the Yam Suf. It's not actually in Hebrew. Red Sea is not Red Sea. It was changed somewhere along the way from Reed Sea to Red Sea. Why? Because the guy who lived there, his name was Reed. He didn't want to have such an Irish name, so he changed it to Red. Oh, I don't.
Actually, Suf in Egyptian meant papyrus. It's the papyrus plant.
Yeah, because it's made out of reeds.
And it's made out of reeds, and that's how we know that it wasn't the Red Sea, because the Red Sea was saline, and you can't grow papyrus in saline.
I remember the first time I went to the Red Sea, I was 8 years old. I said, it's not red. I thought it was, I thought there was going to be, thought the blood was still there. But it's not red. There are reeds, though. You can see the reeds. There's a fan. Okay. One more commentary on verse 17 there from Nachmanides. Ed, would you mind reading the Ramban, the last source on the first side there?
The reason they would experience war if they went by the way of the land of the Philistines is that the Philistines would surely not have given them permission to go peacefully through their land, and thus they might return to Egypt. But by the way of the wilderness, they would not see war until they came to the lands of Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, which were given to Israel. At that time, they were already far from Egypt, and there was thus no reason to fear that they would be tempted to return to Egypt because of war. The war of Amalek and Rephidim was no reason for the Israelites to return to Egypt, since they did not pass through the land of the Amalekites. Rather, Amalek came from his country and warred against them because of his hatred of Israel. This reminds me of something. Even if they were to take their own course to return to Egypt, it would be to no avail, since Amalek would fight them on the way. Besides, they were already far from Egypt because of the circuitous route which they had followed, and they knew of no other route.
Okay, so this is an amazing observation from Nachmanides. What is he saying is the difference between Amalek and the Philistines?
Amalek is an aggressor. They're taking the offensive.
Very good. They're a pursuer. The Philistines won't bother you unless you come and bother them. So the irony of this is, what God says is, I'm not going to take you in the direction of the Philistines because I don't want you to fear war. Okay. But as soon as they leave Egypt, they're attacked by a different nation anyway. They're going to have to deal with war anyway. So if God really didn't want them to deal with war right after they left Egypt, why didn't he stop the Amalekites from attacking them? It makes no sense. I'm not taking you in this direction because over there you might fear war. But as you leave, this other nation's coming to attack you anyway, and I'm not going to do anything about it. And the Israelites did go and fight against the Amalekites, and they won. But there was war, and people died on both sides.
They had no way back the other way because they had the sea.
No
Way back. The whole idea is that God didn't want him to go back to Egypt.
Right.
This other way, the sea was in the middle. They couldn't go back.
That's right. That's right. But it couldn't have been the excuse that they're going to see war and they're going to be afraid. They're going to see war anyway. So they might have said, the Amalekites are coming to kill us. Let's go back to Egypt. Because it's before they get to the sea anyway. So that's just what Nachmanides is pointing out. For the difference that he's pointing out is saying, yes. No, I was talking to Eileen.
He was speaking to me. I'm sorry. Maybe God wanted the Jewish people to fight and get their confidence. And they're going to see war over here, and they're going to have to fight, and I want them to. And they'll be victorious, and they'll have their confidence, and they'll know they're strong, but they won't go back to Egypt because I have to put that safety in place. But I do need them to fight and win.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what happens. You know the story with Moses holding his hands up, and when he puts his hands down, they start losing, and then Hur and Aaron hold his hands up, and then they do win the fight. Sherry, and then Stuart?
Well, in the past, you've always said the reason why it took them so long is, and the reason why I think they took a different route was because it took the Jewish people to a certain level And they still had, if they took the short way around, they would never have been in awe of God. And
Okay.
by the time they got to Mount Sinai, they were in awe. So it took them those many days in order to get there.
Okay.
So that's,
Certainly possible. Stuart?
You know, I always see these episodes as having more than one meaning. And one is a philosophical or religious meaning, and Amalek was an historic enemy.
We're still dealing with them.
We are still dealing with Amalek.
Right.
And I think that perhaps this was an example of how we are going to be pursued in the future.
Right.
We are going to win, but we have to stay strong.
Yeah.
And that's what we gain from winning with Amalek
100%.
in this.
100%. So there's 2 mitzvahs in the Torah. 2 of the 613 mitzvahs have to do with Amalek. Right? Remember what Amalek did to you and blot out and destroy Amalek. Those are 2 of the 613. The Philistines were not welcoming us to either, but there's no mitzvah against wiping out the Philistines. Unfortunately. No, it's not the same people. These are not the Palestinians. It's not the same people. But there's no mitzvah for that. Yeah. But that battle, they were always there. In fact, they were still there when the Romans kicked us out, which is why the Romans named the place Philistia, which, whatever, it's a different class. All I want to point out here, and I only have a little bit of time to cover a lot of ground, so I'm going to try and get to it, but what Nachmanides is saying here is the Philistines will only confront you if you enter their territory, whereas the Amalekites will seek you out wherever you are. Okay, so that's the difference there. But I want to take you back to 4 verses in chapter 12 from last week's Torah portion. So if you'll just jump back with me to chapter 12, verse 29. Chapter 12, verse 29. Not that far back. Because a lot happens here very quickly. So I just want to read through it so I can narrate it a little bit. Okay, verse 29. It was at midnight, and God smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, every firstborn animal. And Pharaoh arose at night, all his servants and all Egypt, and there was a great outcry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not a corpse. So now Pharaoh wakes up in the middle of the night, he realizes what's going on, and he starts looking for Moses and Aaron. Right? Verse 31. He called to Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, go out from among my people, even you, even the children of Israel. Go and serve God as you spoke. Take your flock, your cattle, everything." And look at 33. Egypt urged the people to hurry, to send them out to the land. For they said, all of us are dead, or we're all dying. And it is in this moment that millennia of Jewish stomach aches were born from matzah. In this moment, the people picked up its dough when it had not yet become leavened, their leftovers bound up in their garments upon their shoulders. The children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. They took all the silver, gold vessels, etc. This is when they got the arms too. And they emptied Egypt. Okay. Now we just saw something happen here that's really interesting. The end of the 10th plague occurs. Pharaoh is screaming for Moses and Aaron. The Egyptians are so scared, they go to the Jews and tell them, "Get out." They must have gotten out within 18 minutes because they didn't have time for the dough to become bread. Chas v'shalom, it would take another 18 minutes and we wouldn't have to do this every year with the matzah. And they leave. And in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, we see that God's leading them. And up until this point, the Jews are all over the place, schlepping all the stuff, getting all the gold. They have their accountants in the Caymans, dealing with all the stuff they've taken, putting everything in order. And they leave very quickly. So quickly that they don't have time for the bread to rise, and the Egyptians are pushing them out, and God's leading them. And they leave. And they go from this city to that city, and they're on their way out. Clear so far? Moses still hasn't gotten the bones yet. They leave Egypt, and Moses is still there, getting the bones. Does everyone see that? All this 46 minutes was to get to that moment that we just got to. You see that? They left in a huge hurry with God leading them. And God said, we're not going to go to the Philistines. Moses is still looking for the bones. Okay? All right. There's a question? Someone have a question? Ian? Can you take the mic? You can... All right, it was just a joke. We don't need the mic. All right. I can't believe... He said, for those at home... By the way, you can yell as loud as you want. They won't be able to hear you at home without the mic. He said, I can't believe they left without me. It was worth it. It was worth the wait. Yeah. Can you use pass the mic back, please? Where's the... Stuart, can you pass that mic? Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it seems like it would have taken them a little while to gather up all this loot that they got. I mean, leaving without having the bread rise, they must have been in a big hurry, but how could they get all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean...
It was a miracle.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it was a miracle. I don't know. I mean, they took... Put it all in the dolphin skin. Yeah, I don't... again, the video is grainy, so it's hard to tell exactly what happened. But what we see here is, I think this is the point. It's not the point that they got out so quickly they didn't have time for the bread to rise. I think what the point is that it was chaotic. That's an important idea. That it was, all of a sudden, Pharaoh's running around. I mean, imagine this scene. Running around in the streets. Where's Moses? Where's Aaron? I got to find them. Because we're all going to die. We need to get rid of these Jews. And the Egyptians are saying, go, get out. Here's some more silver. Here's some more gold. Go. But while this is happening, while all of this chaos is going crazy, and everyone's leaving, Moses has somewhere else to go, which is very interesting. Okay. Yeah. Can you use the mic?
Just to provide some clarity.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of this. 5 in 14. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his courtiers had a change of heart, suggesting a division there between the king and Pharaoh.
Wait, I'm sorry, what verse are you looking at?
In 14:5.
Oh, all right. Go on to 14.
So I'm trying to get some clarity as to whether they are one and the same or whether they really are two different people and we're dealing with...
Well, look, I wasn't going to get to chapter 14 until next year at this time. So, because that's, you're already looking second try. So I have I anticipated a year to prepare for this. Okay, right. So obviously they changed their mind because they go and chase after them. So what happened in between What happened in between? We need to get rid of them right now because we're all going to die, and let's go get them back.
But the decision maker is Pharaoh, not the king. And the king only learns later. And they are two separate. Is this a change in the way Egypt is ruled in that intro?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. It's a very interesting idea, because generally when we hear the king of Egypt, the Torah uses the word paro, Pharaoh. But here in verse 5, it says, Vayugad lemelech Mitzrayim, and it was told not to Pharaoh, but to the king of Egypt. So according to Rashi, it's the same person. Rashi says, Pharaoh sent supervisors with them. Once they arrived at the conclusion of the 3-day period, which they had set up to go to worship in the, et cetera, they came, and Rashi uses the word Pharaoh in his commentary. They came and told Pharaoh on the 4th day. However, what I think the Torah is indicating is once the Jews left, Paro is not really Paro anymore. He's been degraded. Which is a really interesting idea. Jeff, can you pass the link to Bill? And then we'll try.
Isn't this the point at which the Pharaoh actually recognizes the God of the Jews because he asks for a blessing from them upon him?
Wait, I'm sorry, can you say it one more time?
Pharaoh asks for a blessing.
Last week, right.
And he wants a blessing from their God, from the God of the Jews.
Yeah.
So he recognizes that.
Look, Pharaoh's a slow learner. He really is, because there are plenty of moments where you feel like he's going to get it, and then he reverts back, which is a message for all of us, because oftentimes we feel like we're growing, and but to really grow and evolve, it takes a real commitment. Like on January 1st, I said, okay, I'm going to go to the gym a lot this year. And I did the first week of January. I haven't been since. But that first week, I was really, so it's easy to say you're going to do something, but to really follow through with it, that's something a little tougher. And we see with Pharaoh that he doesn't, unless you believe the Midrash later on that he becomes the king of Nineveh that we talked about last week, and that ultimately he does. It's possible. It's possible. I wouldn't think that this Pharaoh cared about Joseph or even knew who he was, because after Joseph died, look, when Joseph died, he was very famous. And the Pharaoh loved him. I don't know if he loved him, but he needed him. And so he treated him with great respect. But then the next Pharaoh comes around, and Joseph's buried at the bottom of the Nile, and the next Pharaoh says, the Torah says, didn't even know him, he didn't even care about him. So to think hundreds of years later that the Pharaoh still cared about him, probably not. But who did care about him? Moses. So in the midst of all the chaos, when everyone's running out and taking the gold and the silver and getting ready to leave, and God's leading the Jewish people, and they're talking about where they're going, Moses is somewhere else. And he's looking for the bones. Now, he's got 2 reasons to look for the bones. And the bones, I think, are the whole story here. So, one is the Jews promised. There was a promise made to Joseph that they would find him and bring him with them. But that's not so helpful to, by the way, later on, do you remember the story? We'll get to it later on in the Torah, when it's Passover. And a certain group of Jews comes and says, we're not able to bring the Passover sacrifice because we're impure. And Moses says, no problem. Come and purify yourselves, and you'll come in a month. And that's why we have a custom called Pesach Sheni, the second month. So why is it that those people were impure? Because those were the people who were carrying the coffin of Joseph. And from there, they needed a month to purify themselves, and they were traveling. So Moses says, okay, well, we'll put Joseph's coffin down for a month, and you won't have to carry it. And then in a month, you can come and offer your sacrifice, and that'll be called Pesach Sheni, which is something we still have today. What are you supposed to do on Pesach Sheni? Eat a piece of matzah. So a month after the first day of Passover, you don't have to, but the custom is to eat a piece of matzah 1 month later to recognize the Pesach Sheni. But there were two arks that the Jews carried together. One was the Ark of the Covenant that carried the Ten Commandments, and the other ark was the coffin of Joseph. And they were next to each other. They didn't touch, but they carried them both. So what I'm saying is that because we know that it was just important that as the Ark of the Covenant was leading the Jewish people as they were marching through the wilderness, it was just as important that Joseph's tomb was leading them as well. And the question is why? Now, the reason that the Jews had to wander in the desert for 40 years, there were only supposed to be 4 books of the Torah. There was not supposed to be Bamidbar. It was supposed to go from Leviticus to Deuteronomy, and now we're in. But then there was that sin of 40 years, and we got Bamidbar in the wilderness. It wasn't supposed to happen. Wilderness was supposed to be, 10-day journey, whatever. So, why was it that they had to wander for 40 years? Because of the sin of the spies. What was the sin of the spies? Right, but what didn't they want to do, more specifically? Not the principle, but the actual deed was they didn't want to go to the land of Israel. They didn't believe that they could conquer the land of Israel. They didn't trust. Exactly. They didn't trust that they could conquer the land of Israel. Now, who represents trust that the Jews are going to Israel?
3 spies still said good.
Well, 2. Joshua and Caleb. Caleb and Joshua. There are 2 good ones. 10 bad ones, 2 good ones. But they went with the majority. The people followed the 10. But why does Joseph represent trust? Who's Joseph? What is Joseph? So we think of Joseph as, my father must have loved Israel more than me, because he said, bury me right away. And I say, I went to Israel to bury him, but then I went back. And not only that, but I said, bury me here, and you'll take me at some later date. Don't worry about that. Israel, being buried in Israel is not that important to me. But we dealt with that problem by looking at a couple of sources that told us, no, it wasn't Joseph's choice. The Egyptians made him come back. They needed him. They forced him to come back, and they forced him to be buried in Egypt. But what does Joseph say at the end of his life? Take me with you. So one last source from the 16th century, the Kli Yakar, on the back of the sheet. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. The verse is juxtaposed to the previous verse. The Jews ascended Egypt armed. Because it states in the Midrash on this portion that the Jews would journey in the desert with 2 arks. That of the Shekhinah, meaning the 10 Commandments, the tablets, and that of Joseph, meaning Joseph's coffin. And the nations of the world would ask, what's the point of having this ark of Joseph together with the Ark of the Covenant? And they would answer, this one fulfilled what is in this one. For Joseph fulfilled all the 10 Commandments. Another point, because Moses saw that the Lord, blessed is he, was leading them towards the Sea of Reeds. And Moses thought, lest the sea stop us, it will split in the merit of Joseph. The reason we explained above in Parsha Vayeshev. Kind of like you said, that Moses and Joseph both have something special to do with water, and in this case, not just the Nile, but the Red Sea as well. But here's what happened. Why would the Red Sea split because of Joseph? Because Joseph had faith, Joseph had trust. But how do we know that? The way we know that is what did Joseph say at the end of his life? Take me with you, not if you leave, when you leave. The idea of Joseph was the guarantee, the idea of Joseph, the first slave, meaning the first one who was confined to Egypt and couldn't leave. Right? Think about that. The first one who was confined to Egypt and couldn't leave. But the promise of Joseph, the guarantee of Joseph was, I'm buried here, but not if you leave someday, take me with you. When you leave and go to the land of Israel, then you'll take me with you and you'll bury me there. And by the way, they take him back and they bury him in Shechem. Shechem is Nablus. Why Shechem? Because that's where he was sold into slavery. And they brought him back to where the original sin happened. And you can go there today. I wouldn't recommend it right now. Nablus is not the most wonderful spot. One of the shames of it is I've been there many times. Not many times. I've been there a handful of times. But it's like a war zone. I mean, there's walls everywhere. It's really dangerous to go there. There's fighting that happens there quite a bit. But Jews go there to daven in Shechem. So Rachel's tomb as well, also very unpleasant. But the idea was this. While everyone and the chaos and the Jews were leaving Egypt, Moses said, that's great, we're leaving. But if we're actually going to get to where we're going, we need Joseph. So I'm going back to get Joseph. I'm doing my hocus pocus. We're going to bring him up from the Nile River. He's going to float to the top. I'm going to take Joseph. And then what's going to happen is we're going to get out into the wilderness, and these Jews are going to be afraid. And they're going to see the water, and they're going to be scared. But because Joseph believed that this was going to happen, God's going to split the sea, and we're going to go through. Unfortunately, despite having Joseph, the Jews eventually fell to what he was worried about, the sin of the spies and fearing that they could go in and conquer the land of Israel. However, their children grew from that. And the next generation was the generation that carried Joseph's body, or carried his tomb, his coffin into the land of Israel. So Moses, what I'm pointing out is this. It's weird how they left. They left in the middle of the night. They didn't have time for the dough to rise. We saw that in chapter 12, the end of chapter 12. They run out. God is leading them. The Torah specifically tells us twice that God is leading them. Moses is dealing with the bones. Moses gets the bones. Finally, he catches up to them. And now, as he catches up to them, we're going to come to, right as Moses catches up with Joseph, and the Jews are looking at the Egyptians coming from one way, and the sea is standing in front of them, Moses comes with Joseph, and what happens? The sea splits, and they go through. And that's a sign to the Jewish people. Why'd the sea split? Why'd the sea just split? Because Moses brought Joseph. And what does Joseph represent? Joseph's the one who said, yes, I have faith. This is going to happen. We're going to Israel. And so the sea splits. Later on, they get close. And the spies actually go into the land of Israel. And right when they get really close, the Jews have some of that Egyptian left in them. Right? Because remember, Pharaoh, he's on the right to doing the right thing, but he can't quite get there. And that's what happens to that generation. That generation who was born in Egypt has that, characteristic of Pharaoh, of Egyptian. That they're born in Egypt, and they're not quite ready. But the next generation that's born in the wilderness and not born in Egypt, they do trust Joseph. And what do they have in common with Joseph? Joseph wasn't born in Egypt either. Joseph was born in the land of Israel, and that's where they're going. But they couldn't go without him. Okay. All right. Shabbat shalom. Yes,
Testing 1 2.